Good morning. My name is Jackie Anderson. I'm an assistant dean at the University of St. Thomas, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our fall online learning series. I'd like to begin this morning by wishing you all a happy Veterans Day and extending our heartfelt gratitude for all who have served this great democracy. So thank you for your service. Now, today's fall online learning series is focused on crafting a post-pandemic organizational strategy with University of St. Thomas professor Mike DeVaughn. Now, he'll focus on discovering why and how you should be thinking differently about your organization strategy as we emerge from the pandemic in 2021. But before I introduce Mike, I'd like to take a moment and preview upcoming attractions. And we're going to be wrapping up our fall online learning series in December. And I'm delighted to announce that on Thursday, December 17th, we'll be joined by David Magee. He is a principal in Ablin, Magee, Underberg and Associates, an executive recruiting firm here in the Twin Cities that was actually just recently voted best executive recruiting firms for 2020 in the Forbes list. So we're delighted to have him joining us, and he'll be focusing on the theme of your best professional foot forward in 2021. We hope you can join us. Now, another note is if you're interested in healthcare, our Future of Healthcare conference is going to be virtual this year, and it'll be a series of one-hour events. And our first session is this Friday, November 13th from 8 to 9. Dr. Brent Asplin is the president of Village MD. It's an organization that offers full service doctor offices in stores. And they just recently cemented a partnership with Walgreens, which means that over the next 5 years, they'll be opening 500 to 700 clinics in Walgreens stores. So it should be a great session. We're going to include that link in our chat, as well as feel free to visit our website. So with that, let's get on to our plan for today. In a moment, I'm going to hand over this digital platform to Professor Mike DeVaughn, but please feel free to use the chat feature throughout the presentation. Just send the chat to all panelists, and I will hold the questions for the end. And as always, we plan to wrap up around 8:50 or 8:55. And if you have to step away for any reason, or you have any difficulty, please know the session is being recorded and we'll be sending out that link in the next few days. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce University of St. Thomas professor Mike DeVaughn. Mike is a professor in our management department here at the University of St. Thomas and teaches strategic management courses to both undergraduates and graduate levels. In addition, Mike has recently been instrumental in the complete relaunch of our mini MBA program. We actually have another session starting on December 7th. Now, prior to joining St. Thomas, Mike had spent nearly a decade in industry and worked at PepsiCo, Bank of America, and Purina. And as you know, having that practical industry experience is a hallmark of University of St. Thomas. Now, Mike has an MBA from Indiana University with an emphasis in marketing and HR. And he has his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in strategy and organization theory. Always a delight to listen to. I can promise you a wonderful session. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Mike DeVaughn to our fall online learning series.
Thank you, Jackie. Before we get started, I thought I'd share a little bit about my background, about how I became interested in questions like we're going to tackle today. Really going back to even my doctoral work at the University of Wisconsin, I've always been interested in puzzles in the business world. And one of the things that the pandemic has certainly provided us with is lots of puzzles about how things have gone topsy-turvy with firms in terms of their strategy. For example, and I can't help but going back, given that I've worked at Pepsi, I'm always fighting the cola wars. I guess once you work for Coke or Pepsi, you're always still invested in those companies. And one of the interesting things that I've noticed during the pandemic was that Pepsi was outperforming Coke with respect to volumes of carbonated soft drinks sold. And it was interesting because Pepsi had always been a laggard, largely because of Coke's fountain pouring rights, right? You go to a restaurant has either Coke or Pepsi and not both. In channels where Coke and Pepsi, where customers have choice, like the grocery store or mass merchants, Pepsi actually performs much better in terms of market share. But interestingly, what has happened with the pandemic, as we all know, with the stay-at-home orders, restaurants, events, and those type of things have actually suffered quite a bit. And so most of Coke's advantage against Pepsi sort of went away. And again, so things are sort of topsy-turvy. And so it was questions like this I've always been interested in. And again, the pandemic presents us with an opportunity to examine some of these questions in more detail. So that's why I'm interested in this, and this is how I've come at this problem. So let me start. I'm going to share my screen here with our plan for today. I thought I'd start out just to ensure that we're all on the same page about how firms or organizations in general really approach strategy in terms of their formulation. So just so we're all on the same page, I want to share with you what I've observed in my 2 decades of teaching about how firms kind of go at strategy. Then we'll move on to talking about what the pandemic has revealed about companies, about industries. We'll talk about specific effects of the pandemic, and then wrap up with a bunch of open questions. And I wish I had a whole bunch of answers for you, but I think together we can work through some of these open questions. At least I can give you a framework about how to think about these questions that still remain open. So that's kind of our game plan for this morning. So strategy formulation. One of the things I've observed is that firms really take really one of 2 approaches when thinking about how to form strategy. First, I call it the inside-out approach, where firms try to figure out situations where they can exploit their unique competencies, right? That they have something unique to offer the customer that their competitors don't. And through that, they're able to get a competitive advantage because, again, of these unique competencies that they actually have. I like to use the example of a carpenter. And if you think about a carpenter has a tool bag with a number of different tools in it. And the assumption is that most carpenters have most of the tools that they need to build a house or something like that. However, there are some carpenters that have special tools, a special saw, say, or some kind of special tool that allows them to build different houses than their competitors. This would be the example of an inside-out approach, that you have a special set of tools in your toolkit, then you go look for opportunities to use these special tools. And I'm going to steal this phrase that I heard from one of my colleagues about this inside-out approach. It's really, he said, it's you can make the music only you can make. So again, because you have a unique set of assets, a set of skills and competencies, only you can do this job as well as and shut your competitor out. So that's the inside-out approach. An example of the inside-out approach is here, I guess right here in Minnesota. This is a picture, if I need to remind you, of the one of the original iPods. And the key to iPod being successful was the fact that they were able to use as a component a high capacity, very small hard drive. And again, if you remember the early MP3 players, they relied on what was called removable media, right? And they were very limited, right? They had 16 megabytes, then it went up to 32, went up to 64, and eventually kind of topped out at about 512 megabytes. The game changer was when Apple was able to secure these high capacity 1-inch hard drives and put them inside the MP3 player, and that really blew up the market for MP3 players. And again, and put Apple on the trajectory that it's on now. And the interesting thing to note, of course, is that 1-inch hard disk was actually produced right here in Minnesota by IBM down in Rochester. And that division was sold to Hitachi. So I like to say that we had a hand in the success of the iPod. The second approach is the outside-in approach. So instead of saying, what are my unique advantages and where are places I can exploit those, firms take the opposite approach. They start with the outside first and they look inside. So through an environmental analysis where they're scanning and identifying and looking for new trends, where is it, where are the opportunities that I can exploit with the set of competencies that I actually have? So again, this outside-in approach. And this is really, if you think about it in this way, firms are really trying to answer this question of where to play, exactly who they should target, what market opportunities are available to them. So this outside-in approach. And if you're a fan of Clayton Christensen, who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, he talks about this as a jobs to be done kind of framework. And he says it's important for companies to think about and organizations to think about, why is the customer hiring your product? What problem are you trying to solve? So again, just to put this in context, a good example is Snickers. And if you're like me, you've got a couple Snickers bars lying on your counter still hanging around from Halloween. And Snickers has had this positioning for quite a bit now. And the idea is Snickers is not trying to sell itself as another candy bar, but really they're trying to solve the problem of satisfying hunger urges between meals. And so if you're still hungry after lunch and it's not quite time for dinner, Snickers is the answer. So again, this will be emblematic of what I would call the outside-in approach. In reality, though, firms really use both of these approaches, right? They look at the market and they try to determine where to play, again, using the market opportunities that are available to them. And then they turn internal and say, what competencies do I have to exploit these markets that I see from my external analysis? And then once firms do that, where to play, how to win, the next step is what I call a set of belief statements. What do you need to believe about your customers? What do you need to believe about the industry that you're competing in? What do you need to believe about your competition? And what do you need to believe about your own capabilities? And herein is where the pandemic enters, right? The pandemic has really affected all four of these key components. It's changed how customers potentially view your products and services. It changes their expectations about what they want out of their products now. Certainly has had incredible effect on different industries. It has affected different industries in different ways. It has impacted your competition, and it certainly has impacted capabilities in that we've seen firms pivot and do things that they never thought they could do before as a result of the pandemic. So my key point here is that the pandemic has really affected strategy formulation in the sense that it's affected these four key components of the strategy making process. So the pandemic strikes. And the question that I've been asking both my students and asking myself as I read the Wall Street Journal each day and learn about these incredible stories, what has the pandemic revealed? And the first thing I want you to think about, what has the pandemic revealed about your industry? So I want you to think about this in a broad sense. Don't think about your firm just yet, but what has the pandemic revealed about the industry in which you compete? And I think you'll find that there are some things that were known about the industry that the pandemic has sort of ripped the cover off, so to speak. And then you've probably gathered some things that were unknown. Well, I didn't know that this industry was vulnerable to these kinds of conditions. The pandemic has also revealed that there are critical dependencies that your company, your organization may depend on certain things to get its work done, and that there are critical interdependencies as well. And I'll explain what I mean by this distinction between the dependencies and the interdependencies in a second. I've got a few examples that I'd like to walk through. The first one, clearly this is a picture of the restaurant, and as you know, you've been reading, the restaurant industry has been severely impacted by the pandemic. And this is a quote from one of my students in the mini MBA program that I ran 2 sessions ago. And he said, one of the things that the pandemic has revealed about the restaurant industry is that today's meals pays today's bills. So he said, with most restaurants, there is very little in terms of a cash cushion. And so the meals that we're actually serving today, those receipts will go to pay the vendors that pay for the ingredients that actually went into that meal. And so the idea that restaurants have this big cash reserve that they could rely on when their service was interrupted was just not true, and that the pandemic revealed this. And it's interesting because this gentleman had been a general manager of several restaurants here in the Twin Cities. He says, this is a well-known fact for folks who are in the industry. So this would fall under the category of what the pandemic has revealed, things that are already known. I'll choose my industry now, higher education. One of the things that the pandemic revealed is how important, how dependent universities are on students being on campus. If you think about the business model, if you will, of universities and colleges, we think about tuition being the big revenue bucket. But the fact of the matter is most colleges discount tuition. So there are very few colleges that get, quote, full price for most of their students. And so really tuition dollars are discounted. Where the bulk, where a good percentage of the dollars are actually earned is these services by students being on campus. So for example, room and board, right? These are fees that we charge students for living on campus, and those drop to the bottom lines of colleges. All the ancillary services, right? If you don't have students on campus, they're not spending extra money at lunch. They're not buying sweatshirts at the bookstore. And a host of other things that students normally spend money on. If they're absent from campus, right, these are fees that universities aren't collecting. And again, the pandemic has really ripped the cover off of this and really exposed the business model of higher education. So now we're moving to dependencies, right? And this clearly is a picture of sanitizing an airplane. And what we've learned, again, that air travel is dependent on public confidence. And I would argue this is something that was known not only within the industry, but also outside of the industry, right? We've had a number of different scares with SARS, H1N1, and clearly 9/11, right? Those were all events where there was some interruption to the airline industry. And again, that they had to work to get public confidence back up to get people on the planes. But clearly, we've not seen a shock like we've seen with the pandemic that has lasted up until now. We're 8 months into this thing. And so the airline industry has been severely impacted due to a lack of public confidence with respect to flying. Now, again, I want to be clear that they've made some inroads, right? There are people getting back onto flights. I think I read recently that the TSA screenings at airports are now up more than 1 million people. And so airlines are actually coming back a bit, but still they're nowhere near the levels of capacity that they had prior to the pandemic. And here's the thing, right? And this is what I mean by, like I said in the previous slide, about interdependency. It's great if the airlines are successful in actually getting folks to get on the plane, right? You don't have to be afraid, and you're not going to get the virus by getting on the plane. Then they have to contend with what are the passengers going to do when they get to their destination. And this is obviously a picture of an empty Disney World. So until there are things that customers can be sure when they get to their destinations, that are things to do, the restaurants are open, there are leisure activities where they can get involved, they're still unlikely to take a flight, even if they have confidence that they won't catch the virus on the plane. So again, this is an example of interdependencies. And again, I don't think this is necessarily unknown, that we've known for a long time that all these things are linked to hospitality industry, rental cars, hotels, all these things are linked. But again, as important it is for the airline industry to gain confidence, to get folks' confidence up, it's also important that they actually have things to do. And again, a recent example of this, I just read 2 days ago that Alaska Airlines is now offering free ski lift tickets when you fly to Denver. So again, a real shot at trying to answer this question: what will you do when you get there? So now that we've thought a little bit broader about the industry, let's think about your organization. The question that I'd like for you to ask yourself: what has the pandemic revealed about your specific organization? What has it done, or what does it say about the way that you're organized to conduct business? And we'll talk about these in a second. And then finally, what does it say, or how has it impacted the products and services that you choose to offer? And again, let me work through a couple of examples here. And again, this is a great sign that was in the window of a restaurant, right? Most restaurants have had to pivot pretty hard to basically just survive the pandemic. So a restaurant that was largely dine-in oriented now has done, as the sign says, they have to do takeout, they have to do drive-through, they have to do pickup, they have to do curbside service, right? So they've had to pivot in order to basically save their business. And again, we've seen an incredible amount of innovation in restaurants in the Twin Cities, of things that they've done to really pivot to basically save their business. Also, specific companies, the quote, the winners so far during the pandemic have been those who've embraced this idea of the multi-channel or the omni-channel fulfillment. And again, Target has been at the center of this, right? That you not only, first of all, Target was very lucky that its stores were designated as essential. And so the stores were open, but even if you were uncomfortable going to the store, of course, you could have the product shipped to you. And then they had been working on their drive up, their contactless drive up. So this ended up being a godsend for their business. The fact that they had already been working on this drive up channel really was an important piece of how they were able to successfully navigate this pandemic. And then this business of the essential business. And I'm not sure about you, but I listened pretty carefully to all the updates that the governor and the economic development department for the state when they had this phased reopenings and which stores could reopen and which ones couldn't. And it's interesting, a store like Menards got a lot of flack because they were designated as an essential business. And again, I'm not quite sure what the criteria was, something about having building materials and things like that. But if you've ever been in Menards, I'm not sure there isn't anything, put it this way, that Menards doesn't sell, right? You can get clothes, you can get food, you can get steaks, and perhaps that's why they were designated as an essential business. One interesting story, though, was Jo-Ann Fabrics, right? It was also designated as an essential business, not right away, but in the second wave of approvals, Jo-Ann Fabric was designated as an essential business. Why? Because they sold fabric that allowed people to make the face masks that we needed to wear during the pandemic. And so stores like Jo-Ann Crafts and Fabric were open, and stores like Macy's and traditional retailers were still closed. And I know that was a big sore point with a lot of folks in the retail industry. So again, if your product offerings qualify you to be an essential business. We've also seen lots of pivoting in terms of restaurants and services about menu rationalization. Coca-Cola announced a few weeks back that they were getting rid of over 200 of their brands. So they're cutting their product portfolio by 200. And clearly they're not going to cut Original Coke or Coca-Cola Classic or Sprite, any of their mainstays, but they were talking about some of their flanker brands or some of the more cult brands. For example, if you are a fan of Tab, and I know there are folks who trade Tab on the internet, they're finally going to stop making Tab. Zico coconut water, they're going to drop that brand. And again, the second picture here panel has to do with McDonald's. McDonald's announced that they were actually dropping 100 menu items from their menu board. And again, this is a little bit of trickery with McDonald's because they don't have, thousands of options in terms of products. But I think they're counting things like if you get bacon on your Big Mac, they count that as a different product. But the fact of the matter is, we're seeing lots of companies as a way to deal with the pandemic and increase the efficiency of their supply chain to really cut the number of products that they're actually offering, whether it's beverages or actual food items. So that leads to what have been the effects of the pandemic, right? What kind of effects have it actually had on specific companies? And here's where I hope that I can add value for you to think about your industry, your company, your business, right? From my look at this, from my read of the situation, the pandemic has done one of three things for firms. I call it rev, reset, or reimagine. In the rev category, it's taken trends that were probably slow moving within an organization or something that companies were thinking about doing or they were just doing in a test phase. And the pandemic has really sped that up because you've had to. Another good example of what we just talked about is with Target, right? They've had to, they were sort of dipping their toe into the drive up. And then when the pandemic hit and they sort of leaned into the whole accelerating of this trend, and that people have adopted it pretty easily. The second bucket is reset. it's interesting. One of the things that I've observed is the pandemic has given really a second chance or an opportunity for firms to reboot themselves, uh, either with products that had fallen out of favor or trends that were for unfavorable for specific organizations or companies. Now it's opened the door for them to get a second chance. And a good example of this is think about all the meal the meal kit companies, and Blue Apron being one of the largest ones, had themselves up for sale. And then all of a sudden, when we had to get meals at home, they became relevant again. So an opportunity, second chance, or a reboot, or what I call reset. And then the third category of effects is reimagine. So these are the industries and the companies that have been so affected by the pandemic, it's really basically cut into the way that they've done business, or the way they would like to do business, or their business model requires them to do business. So it's been a fundamental rethink or reinvention of how to serve their customers in a different way. So again, for my money, it's really the pandemic has either revved up and accelerated existing trends. It has offered a chance to reset or reboot, a chance to get back into the game if you were selling a product that had fallen out of favor, or you were on a trend line that was unfavorable, or it's offered you an opportunity to reimagine and reinvent the business model for your business. So let me give you a couple of examples in each of those boxes. In the Rev category about speeding up, two great examples of this, of course, is telemedicine, which has gotten most of the attention in the media, and then also cashless payments. And I want to tell you just a quick story about the telemedicine. And again, this was from one of my students in the mini MBA program. Her husband works for one of the big healthcare companies in town. And he was just so happened to be in charge of rolling out telemedicine. And before the pandemic, clearly he was having some difficulty in doing that. And since the pandemic, everybody has sort of jumped on to this trend because they've had to, and including healthcare providers having to pivot to actually do this. And he said that he accomplished his 5-year goal in the span of 5 weeks in terms of the number of patients that they wanted to see via telemedicine. Cashless payments is another example of this. Uses of Venmo and PayPal and things like that. People were uncomfortable touching the credit card machines. And we're starting to see here in the US a widespread or a wider spread adoption of these cashless tap-to-go payment systems with credit cards, which again is a trend that's widespread in Europe and places like New Zealand and Australia, but hadn't really taken off here in the United States. In the reset category, again, I have a picture here of Campbell's Soup. Campbell's Soup had experienced declining sales for the past 3 years. All of a sudden, the pandemic hits. We need brands that we trust, that are shelf stable, because we were uncertain of how long we'd be under lockdown. All of a sudden, Campbell's Soup is flying off the shelf, right? And so it's given Campbell's an opportunity to reintroduce us to the benefits of soup. And as I said before, an example, subscription meal kits sort of falls into this bucket as well. But on the reimagine side, where businesses have been fundamentally changed, again, dining restaurants have really had to rethink their business in major ways. And then again, we've seen all kinds of innovations come out of that because they've had to reimagine their business. But probably one that you haven't thought about, and again, that's close to me because I work at an institution of higher education, is standardized testing. So people like the ETS, the Educational Testing Service, that make the SAT and the ACT scores. One of the things that has happened this year, or at the end of last year, right, students were unable to sit for those exams because of the pandemic. And as a result, colleges, for the freshmen that are on campus now, allowed basically students to apply without an official ACT or SAT score. And what's happening now, given that we're 8 months into this and it's testing season again, and it's likely that another set of students won't be able to test as well. Now, this is an interesting sort of conundrum for the Educational Testing Service, right? Because next year, they're going to have half of college students could have been on campus without having taken an ACT or an SAT exam. And colleges themselves may realize, hey, we're doing just fine without students. We've seated the class we want to seat. The students are progressing well in school. What is the real value of the ACT or the SAT exam? And so if you're the educational testing service, where most of your revenues comes from students taking these kind of tests, you're going to really have to rethink your business model and find new uses for these tests, or adapt the tests in a way where folks can take them in remote locations. So a couple other effects here. This is interesting. The pandemic has really changed the basis of competition. And if you think about this, these are four different chains, places of accommodation, right? A Days Inn, sort of a traditional motel. As you can see from the picture, you drive up, you go to your door, you go right in. The Ritz-Carlton and Marriott, these are more high-end accommodations. And really their point of difference is the amenities and the services that they offer. But during the pandemic, all of those amenities had to go away, right? The spa is closed, the swimming pool is closed, the fitness center is closed. They're not doing buffet breakfast. All of a sudden, you could make an argument that the Marriott has been essentially reduced to a motel. And all of a sudden, motel chains like Red Roof Inn and Days Inn can effectively compete against the Marriott. In fact, I had been reading in some places, consumers were actually preferring places like motels because they were actually de-densified, right? You were running into people less. You didn't have to get on a crowded elevator. And again, all the amenities that you would actually achieve at a Marriott or a Ritz-Carlton are not there. And so the Days Inn was a little bit cheaper. And this is also extended to, again, to academia as well. And this is actually a line from an article that was in the New York Times. It says, what does Harvard and your local commuter college now have in common? What they have in common is all these institutions now have had to pivot to basically online school, online college. And again, we could make an argument that the University of Phoenixes of the world, they've been doing this a lot longer than Harvard has, right? And again, what are you paying for when you go to Harvard? You're paying for all these amenities, access to top professors. Not necessarily, they're not necessarily set up to optimize on online learning. And again, so the University of Phoenix now, facetiously, is in the same league as Harvard. A couple of other effects here. Sometimes you have to be lucky. Two examples. Walmart had been working on a drive up, and they had admitted that they had been working on this largely to keep pace with Amazon. And again, the pandemic hit. They just happened to make investments in their drive up grocery. And again, timing is everything, as they say. The second example, the picture here is Prime Air. And here, this affects a local company. Prime Air is basically Sun Country. So Sun Country Airlines has been flying for Amazon. And again, timing was beautiful in the case of Sun Country. They had just started flying for Amazon right at the beginning of March, right when the pandemic hit. And when you look at their first quarter earnings, and I think the company said that they actually flew more boxes than passengers in the first quarter that affected the pandemic. So this brings us to these open questions that I mentioned at the top of the presentation here. And again, some of the things that we should be thinking about. First and foremost, of course, every company wants to know, how much longer will this pandemic state last? And again, there's quite a bit of uncertainty here, and obviously things are sort of trending up across the United States. So we're going to be in this state for a little bit longer. So if that's the case, will I have to make investments? What kind of investments will I have to make? Will I have to make investments in new capabilities in order to survive and possibly even thrive during this pandemic? So that's a question. And of course, some of the things that I alluded to earlier about the changes in consumer behavior, will these things stick, right? Will consumers abandon Campbell's soup after the pandemic is over and go back to eating clean foods and non-processed foods? That's a big open question. And of course, will the pre-pandemic consumer behaviors actually return? Will they go back to doing what they were doing before, or will they do some sort of hybrid? While they won't stick with their new trend, perhaps they may do things differently than what they did before the pandemic. And I just did a little research here about how long it actually takes to form a habit. Apparently, there's the common notion is it's about 21 days. And I did a little more digging and found that on average, it takes a person from 18 to 254 days to actually form a new habit. And again, these numbers vary depending on how hard the habit is, or if you're trying to quit smoking or things like that. And the interesting thing is it's 66 days on average for a new behavior to become automatic. So again, even using these metrics, and given that we've been in the pandemic now for 8 months, so we're getting close to those 254 days, perhaps this study provides us with a little bit of insight about whether or not these new trends and new behaviors will actually stick. And then of course, this finally leads us to the old game show, the $64,000 questions from the 1950s. What should you do? And again, I said I didn't have a ton of answers for you about what specifically you should do, but here's some things that I think that should guide your thinking. So I've taken 3 industries here and thought about the changes that they've had to make. And then the idea then is, if you put your industry in one of these boxes, is my industry like the airline industry, that you could come up with the modifications that you might need in order to be successful and to ride out this pandemic. And again, I won't go over all of these in the interest of time, but in the airline box, you think about all the modifications that have happened. We've seen the dropping of the dreaded change fees, right? Most of those change fees were something north of $200 if you decided that you needed to go on a different day. Those have been dropped. We've seen unprecedented levels of flexibility that airlines are now offering. They're even doing point-to-point flying, so basically abandoning a key feature of their business model in the hub and spoke. They're actually doing point-to-point flying. And of course, their pricing models have been basically upended because people aren't acting the way they had acted in the past. And those models and algorithms are built on past behavior. Restaurants, I won't spend a ton of time here because I've used them as an example. But again, one of the things that's interesting, it's not only that they've had to pivot, but think about the additional costs that they've taken on, right? If you were primarily a dine-in restaurant, you've had to get an online ordering system. So we've seen the rise of companies like Chow Now that helps companies with the front end of their ordering system. And then again, if you're going the delivery route, then you have to figure out how will you deliver. And again, so they're using delivery platforms like Grubhub, DoorDash, and things like that. But the problem, of course, is they take a good chunk of the revenues. My understanding is that Grubhub and places like that, they get about 25% of the revenue. So your favorite restaurant would prefer that you actually would do walk-up or curbside service because they would make more money. And then the final bucket about colleges, again, I think about this closely because I work in a college, but this business of hybrid and online classes, I think going forward, that's going to be part of the mix of every single college, right? That going forward, now that students have been exposed to that and the flexibility of hybrid and online courses, colleges will have to adjust and do something different. The operating model colleges have come into question as well. And I'll just skip down to the last thing about campus amenities. Again, the climbing walls and lazy pools, no students are on campus to use those. And then finally, the extracurriculars. And not so much at a place like St. Thomas, even though we are going Division I here next year, but at places, Big Ten, Pac-10 schools that really rely on football and athletic events, with those things being reduced, it certainly had an impact on the colleges as well. So that's the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for listening, and I'm excited to now transition to hear some of the questions that you have.
As always, Mike, that was amazing. Thank you so much. And as you can expect, we've gotten quite a few questions coming through. So let me start with a couple kind of around the categories. The first one is, do you think the essential, non-essential determination will impact strategy after the pandemic? What would that strategic response look like?
That's a tough question. I think, put it this way, I think companies you've got to deal with this question of essential, right? And this is a big puzzle. That Jo-Ann Fabric thing was really, really interesting. And I think it's going to force companies to look at their product offerings, right? So if this happens again, or some version of this actually happens, do I carry anything in my portfolio that is essential? And this sounds crazy, but you may even think about a small SKU of something that is essential. Like and again, I don't want to cut into our time, but I heard a gentleman on the radio talk about he got into the liquor business as a result of some other disturbance that we actually had. He realized that liquor had been essential. And then, of course, we have the pandemic, and it is essential, and he has made a new life for himself. So I think it's going to cause firms. So yes, it will be part of the strategy making process about what in my product set could be considered essential.
Great, thank you for that. Let's see, let's go to this question. What is going to be key for organizations that fall into the reset category to lock in gains caused by the pandemic in that same genre?
Good. Here's what I'm seeing, and here I have the benefit of a wife who works in marketing research, and I see the kinds of projects she's actually getting, right? So companies are actually calling her with this exact problem. How can you help me lock in the gains that I've actually made? And so they're trying to understand what drove their usage during the pandemic. Was it comfort food? Was it a familiar brand? Is there something that we can bring that forward? So let's take the Campbell's soup example, since I put that up as an example. And I think, how can we make soup relevant again, right? How can I get people, why are they flocking to us now? Is there anything that I can change to make them do this going forward? So I think companies are trying to understand that. They're doing a lot of research right now. They understand this could be potentially temporary, and they're trying to figure out why consumers chose them during the pandemic and how to lock those in.
Thank you. Okay, so this one is going to go to kind of the leadership aspect. Can you discuss the post-pandemic strategy for managing and leading people within an organization? How do we keep employees motivated and creative when there is COVID fatigue? And I know this is kind of outside the scope of this initial presentation, but you got that background in HR as well, so I'm passing it to you.
Good. And we touch on a little of this in sort of strategic leadership, right? Look, I really think we can learn a lot from the restaurant industry. If any industry that's been so impacted by this, and not only the number of pivots they have actually had to actually make. And I think even what we've learned in academia, people are more flexible than we give them credit for. And so I would say, if I'm a leader of your organization and I'm trying to instill some sense of creativity into people, I think the pandemic has given companies license to let the people create. And I would say give your people a little bit more running room and really thinking outside the box. And I think one of the things that has sort of tamped down innovations in big companies is because we put innovation in a box and say, okay, I need you to innovate within this particular box. And the pandemic, like I said before, has ripped the cover off this. And I would encourage you to rip the cover off your organization. And we always say this in kind of a brainstorming situation, no idea is a wacky idea, but really, again, back to a restaurant down the street, they strung together to make their outdoor patio. They strung together a bunch of kegs, roped off the parking lot, went to Menards and bought a couple patio furniture. Boom, they're in business and they're serving 100 people outside in the parking lot, right? That kind of, skunk works kind of innovation.
Oh, thank you. What can the pandemic teach us about accelerating the adoption of these products and practices in general, unrelated to the pandemic? Now, you've already touched on this briefly, but can you take it to the next step?
So I think and it's funny because I teach about this in class, one of the things that really keeps people from adopting, I would say, are cognitive barriers. And so they're not, it's not that people won't do this, it's cognitively they can't get their mind around this, right? And so they won't do it because they think their customers won't accept it, or companies won't do it because they can't conceive of pushing out all the obstacles to actually make it happen. And so I think what could really speed up adoption, unrelated to the pandemic, is to take this same kind of framework and sort of knock down those cognitive barriers. I'll give you a quick personal example. I had a procedure done a few years ago that, and I went to have it done in a place that I wouldn't have had it done because I didn't think it was that serious. So it turned out to be a lot more serious than I thought, and so much more serious that I said, call your wife. I'm gonna take care of this right now. Had I had a choice, I would not have gone to that specific place to have that done, that procedure done, because I had a cognitive barriers. If I have this kind of ailment, I go to this kind of place to get it done. And the fact that I have successfully had it done in that location now has opened my mind that I can get any kind of procedure done at a different kind of place.
All right. All right. And I'm going to try to get through a couple more questions. Sure. What dictates whether or not I should make investments in operation or infrastructure in order to survive/thrive?
I think this is one of these tough questions that you have to ask, the folks who manage with you, right? If this is your, and again, I'm thinking from an entrepreneurial standpoint, if this is your business, your family business, this is your livelihood, like a lot of restaurants, I think you have to make that investment. But I do want to be careful, because you do have an option of doing nothing. And one interesting thing in the pandemic is go look up TJ Maxx, right? They didn't have a web presence, right? So people thought they would get absolutely wiped out by the pandemic. As soon as customers were able to go to the stores again, they had lines out the door around the corner, right? And people went back. And they're still not planning any investments in their digital platform going forward. So do nothing is an option. I want to be clear about that. But also, I think it really depends. How important is this business to you? Is this your family business? Is this your livelihood? And again, we don't know how long the pandemic is going to last. So, it's a tough question about making these investments, but you have to really think through, I want to be in this business.
All right. Well, you tipped your HR kind of hat and leadership hat. So I've got another question for you in that space. Within our business, we are trying to find the right balance of employees on site versus remote. One of the concerns is that camaraderie and employee morale are suffering with the majority of the staff working remote. With all of the strategy focused on products and services of the business, how do we make sure those parts of our culture are still growing and still thriving?
Right. I think here that you do have to have these spots. I've been reading about companies that have given up their leases, right, in saving in space, but they are having monthly meetings. And again, now this has been impacted by our increasing numbers, but they have these points where customers can or their employees can get together. So I'm giving up my lease, but every month we're going to rent a space for them to come together to actually, have this camaraderie, as you say, because we need people, right? We're social beings, and that's we have to have that as well. And so I think providing space for your folks to get together and doing it in a socially distant way. You may not be able to bring all 100 people together at a time, but putting them in pods. I'm going to put together a specific program for 20 of my people here, 25 of my people there, and give your folks an opportunity to socialize and to share ideas as well.
All right. I'm going to try to get in one more question here, and it's about resources. So you mentioned the Wall Street Journal. Is there other great resources that we should be kind of staying connected to? How do we stay best abreast of all the changes? What can we do to be informed?
Yeah, the best thing is, and I'm terrible, I read the Wall Street Journal, but I've got in fact, I had a picture that I took out of the slide, my Wall Street Journal stack this big. And I just really graze the column because you can get overwhelmed, right, with the amount of material and the things you're getting digitally and things like that. My big thing is usually the Wall Street Journal. The left-hand column will kind of point out a couple of key stories. Here's another resource, and I actually do this for my students. There's a podcast called Snacks Daily, and you could probably navigate to it through Apple Podcasts. And it's 15 minutes. They take 3 business stories. There's a theme to it. They tie them together and they kind of tell you kind of what the punchline is. And I listen to that pretty religiously, and I get a lot of my stories for class through this 15-minute podcast. It's called Snacks, like you eat, Snacks Daily. That's a good resource too. So that in the Wall Street.
Fabulous. All right, I'm going to take one last question here, and it's about pulling out your crystal ball. Okay, so there's been an announcement about potential vaccines. What is your advice for organizations that are starting to see this light at the end of the tunnel? What should we be thinking about over the next 6 months, 12 months while this vaccine gets rolled out and a new level of normalcy returns?
Crystal ball. I think and I mentioned this earlier about the investment of understanding where your customer's head is now. I mean, I think, as we all know, even if we get a vaccine tomorrow, it's going to be, 6, 7 months before it gets widespread. And the best thing that you can do in that time frame, in my opinion, is to try to understand, some of the things we talked about earlier, where your customer's head is. I don't think we're going to go, and everyone says this, we're not going to go back to exactly doing the things that we did before. There's going to be some hybrid of the new behaviors and something that looked similar or familiar to what they did before. So I think the best investment of your time is with you and your staff trying to understand where's that hybrid going to be and doing research around that. That's my opinion.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Michael, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. For those of you that participated today, if you enjoyed this session, Michael is kicking off our mini MBA on December 7th. It's a great kind of survey course that lets you kind of see some of the key elements within the MBA program and within a business. So think about that. I hope you will join us next month. Thursday, December 17th, we have David Meiji and the topic of professionally embracing 2021. And also, I mentioned that Future of Healthcare conference. Our first session kicks off this Friday. Dr. Brent Asplin should be a great session. We sent the link earlier. Also, feel free to visit the website. All the information is there, and you should be receiving the link to this session today in the next few days. Happy Veterans Day. Thank you for joining us today. Be well. Hope to see you next month.